Welcome back to another video. This will be another installment of the undergarments part of this project. This video will include the bum pad and then a very short description of a petticoat I threw together really quickly. When cutting out the pattern pieces this time, I tried to be really economical with my fabric. The back of the pattern layout of how to cut out the fabric would waste so much in this case because this needs to be on the fold anyway, so I cut it out kind of weird, but it still worked out. Once you have the first piece completely cut out, the next step is to position the drawstrings. I thought I was smarter than the pattern and I ignored it. I don't know when I'm going to learn that the patterns are always right, but you're supposed to pin them inside because eventually this is going to get flipped right side out. But I was thinking that, I don't really know what I was thinking, but I flipped them the wrong way and I had to go back and fix this like much later on in the project. So word to the wise, follow what the pattern says. Yep, see, there you go. I flipped it the wrong way because I think I'm too smart for the pattern. And then you just sew those in place to keep them out of the way for the rest of the project. But they should be flipped the other direction. The next step is working on the ruffle. You basically cut out 3 long strips and they all need to be sewed together. They didn't mention anything how to finish these seams, and I thought the easiest way to do it would just be to do a French seam. So you sew with a larger seam allowance, you trim it down, and then you flip it the other way with the raw seams hidden inside. And you should really be pressing these, but since it was just a ruffle, I just was going fast. And I think that worked well for finishing off the seams that you won't even see because it's a ruffle and that will be facing the bottom. One of the edges of the ruffles does need to be completely finished because it will be showing. So I just went to my trusty ironing board and ironed in just a double fold, and then I sewed along the edge of the fold all the way down, which took a long time because this thing was like many feet long. The next step for the ruffle is to gather it, so I just sewed along the top of the fabric with a really wide stitch length, I think the largest that my machine would go, and I probably was sewing way too close to the edge and I really should have sewed multiple gathering strings because when you break one it became a pain in the butt and I sort of had to just like manually gather later the parts where the string broke and I couldn't pull the ruffles together anymore. So to do the actual gathering, you grab the bottom string and you can pull the fabric and bunch it together, which is how you get the gathered look. And I found this really difficult for such a long piece. I know people must be much better at it, but I probably fiddled with this for an hour and kept breaking the string and trying to, the thread and trying to find it again and gather again. I think I do have a gathering foot for my machine, so at some point I'll have to learn how to use that so I don't have to do this by hand because I'm terrible at it. I finally stopped fiddling with it when I thought it was probably about the right length to go around the bum pad. So the next step, I just pinned this in place with a lot of pins because I had to make up for some of the places that weren't gathered and sort of fake the gathering with a bunch of pins. And then once this is all pinned down, you then sew it to just one of the pieces to hold it in place before adding the other piece. I wanted to make sure this was evenly gathered, so I started by pinning both of the ends, then finding the middle and pinning that, and then I also found the middle of the halves and pinned that to the place where it sort of dips in to create the 3 pieces of the bum pad. And this was just so I didn't end up with like a bunch of ruffles gathered in one place and then no ruffles in the rest of it. Then you sew on the ruffle very carefully. I wonder if I should have flipped this upside down so that I was just sewing on the smooth piece of fabric instead of the ruffled one, but then I would have a lot less control over these like manual gathered points like you see me doing where my gathering thread failed. But you can see what a mess putting the gathering thread right on the edge of the raw fabric does. It creates all of that like fraying and fly away and just really a mess, and thank goodness that just goes on the inside and no one will ever see that again because it is inside the bum pad. Then the top piece was cut out and pinned over with the ruffles pinned inside, and this is where you have to be careful not to sew over the straps that you're going to be tying on the bum pad with. So this is where I had to go back in and make sure you can see that it's hanging out towards the inside, which is correct, so that when you flip it out, the tie is coming from the outside, or the inside of the pad to the outside. Before flipping it right side out, I did some snips in the places where the extra fabric would stop it from turning out all the way. So in the corners and then along the harsh curves, I just cut little notches. The last thing that needs to happen before adding in the stuffing for the bum pad is to sew the lines that will keep the bum pad in 3 different sections. So I didn't pre-draw these, so I just grabbed out my pattern piece again and looked where that line was marked on the pattern, and then just ended up drawing it straight on the fabric with my air and water-soluble pen, and then just went to the sewing machine and sewed those in really quick. Before messing around with any of the stuffing, I thought it would be easiest to finish the pressing on the final edge that will be sewn. So I just turned the inside of both of the raw edges inwards and almost burned myself there. And that made it much easier later to just go through and add the one final sewing that would close off the stuffing. And then I just gave the whole thing a good press because this is going to be the last time I'm going to be able to iron it because it's going to be full. So I wanted to iron out some of those wrinkles. I know they'd probably go away in time, but I had the iron out already anyway. For the stuffing, I'm just using polyfill from Joanns. I wasn't sure how much I needed because they tell you on the bag that it's good to fill 1 dolly, and I didn't know if 1 dolly was equivalent to 1 bum pad or not, but I had plenty of stuffing. I probably didn't even use half of it, just because this thing is so massive to begin with. If I really filled it out, oh my god, it would be just ridiculous. So I sort of messed around with it for a while until I was happy and it seemed pretty even all around and not super lumpy. I found it really challenging to close this off with pins before sewing it. I'm not sure what the best technique is. I think I ended up going parallel with the seam instead of perpendicular like I normally do to just keep it shut and orderly when I brought it over to the sewing machine. This was definitely the trickiest bit of sewing because you have all that bulk on one side trying to push your needle off the sewing line you're trying to sew, and then at the beginning of the ends of these there is probably like 6 layers of fabric that you're sewing through plus that tie, so it almost didn't even fit under my machine when I started and ended this. But this is going to be the last sewing part of this project. So here is the finished bum pad, but the video is not over yet. The next part is going to be a quick run through of how I made the petticoat because I didn't end up filming any footage of it. I just have the final product. So I was using a medium weight linen for this bum pad, but I went back to my lightweight from my shift leftover linen, and I basically cut out some hip to floor length pieces that were 50 inches wide, and then 2 of them put together would give me the 100-inch circumference of my petticoat, which I think is pretty normal for a petticoat. The side seams were sewn up, they were selvages, so I didn't even finish them, and then I left them open at the edges to then add the ties. So this is side closing, and the top was just pleated, and it was actually too big at first. I meant to leave 2 inches in the center unpleated, I think 4 inches in the center unpleated, but I ended up having to pleat that anyways to make it fit. And then I just hemmed it to the right length once I had all the other undergarments ready. To show the order these get put on, I'm wearing a shift and the stays I made in earlier videos, and then next comes the bum pad, which goes on the hips, and that gets tied in place. And this is to give you the correct historical silhouette. And then the next step, once that's tied on, is the petticoat I just made. And you tie that on first the back half, and the front part ties around the back, and it creates a full skirt, and then you can still access a pocket, which I have yet to make, that will go underneath this whole ensemble. Initially, I thought this bum pad was way too big, and it still might be, and I might have to go rip it out and take some of the stuffing out, but I think once I put my heavy skirt on top, it will be nice and flat. And that is it for the undergarments. The next videos are going to be making the final outfit.